All right, AMP1 students, in this video we are going to talk about muscle metabolism, specifically for our skeletal muscle cells. This is very important because it does require a lot of energy in the form of ATP for muscle contraction to happen. So we want to talk about exactly where that energy is coming from, what all the different sources are. And then we'll also want to know those different sources when we talk about the different types of skeletal muscle cells that we have in our body. So we have skeletal muscle cells in our body, but they're all not created equally. There's a couple of different types, and one of the ways that they differ is based on what their primary source of energy they use for the contractions that they undergo. So we want to talk specifically about the various ways that our skeletal muscles get the ATP they need for contraction. So we do have a picture for this, and let me go to our objectives 2. So we are talking about 15. Identify the sources of energy that are used by muscle cells and fibers. So this picture is kind of big, but I think we can get it all in. Okay, so first I'll explain the picture. So this up here is showing a blood vessel, and so we're seeing the inside of the blood vessel here. It's kind of cut longitudinally. And so we can see some of the components that are inside the blood. And then we have our sarcolemma, which is here, the phospholipid bilayer. And then we have the cytosol, or sarcoplasm is what we call the area between the organelles. And then this here is our mitochondria, one of the mitochondria in this particular skeletal muscle cell or fiber. So we're going to talk about the various ways that skeletal muscle cells get their ATP so that they can contract. The first way is there's always some ATP stored in the skeletal muscle cells. So this is kind of just showing some ATP that was formed that's now in the skeletal muscle cell and waiting to be used for muscle contraction. So we will have some stored, but there's a limited amount, and it takes a lot of ATP for skeletal muscle cell contraction. So that's definitely not going to be enough for long periods of muscle contraction that we need. So that's why we have other sources that will help. That's our first source, the stored ATP. The second source that we'll talk about is this source, where if we have some ADP molecules, which we will. So if you guys remember when we were talking about the cross-bridge cycle, let me go back to that picture real quick to remind you. When we were going over the cross-bridge cycle, remember after ATP bound to a myosin head, and then the myosin head detached, the ATP then would hydrolyze, which means the bond would be broken between the two of the phosphate ions, and then we would get ADP plus inorganic phosphate. And so when that bond's broken, that gives the energy necessary to reset the myosin head into that, or reactivate it into that cocked position. So there's the ADP here. So if we go back to our picture again, we have an enzyme in our skeletal muscle cells called myosin kinase. And what that enzyme does is it'll take any ADP and it will catalyze the chemical reaction where the phosphate of 1 is broken off and added to the ADP molecule here. And so then we'll get ATP, and then we'll have AMP as a byproduct of that reaction. So that's another source of ATP, is through this action of the myosin kinase enzyme, and it takes 2 ADP molecules and makes an ATP molecule. Again, limited amounts of that. We only have so much of that enzyme in the cell, so that's not going to allow for longer than a few seconds of muscle contraction. So So we have other sources. The third source also includes an enzyme, and it will provide more ATP than our stored in myosin kinase. And that enzyme's creatine kinase. And then what that enzyme works on is creatine phosphate. And what it will do is it'll break the bond. So this creatine phosphate has a phosphate on it. It will break that bond between the creatine and phosphate and add that inorganic phosphate to another ADP molecule. And then we'll get ATP, and then creatine is the byproduct there. So that is the third way that the cell can get ATP, is through the action of the creatine kinase enzyme. And again, you should know that it is a reaction that includes creatine phosphate donating a phosphate to ADP to make ATP. So those are 3 ways, and they don't require, there's some characteristics you should know. They don't require any oxygen to be carried out, so none of those require oxygen. But there is limited amount of ATP, meaning that, we only have a certain amount of myosin kinase and creatinine kinase and even creatine phosphate, so and ATP stored. So it's not going to last very long, seconds. So we want to have other sources of energy that will provide more energy quicker and for longer periods of time. So that is where we come to our 4th source of energy for muscle contractions. And what we usually just call it glycolysis. There's other names for it. I think sometimes they'll call it anaerobic metabolism. But I think we should just stick with glycolysis, because remember, hopefully, from chapter 3, glycolysis was one of the steps in cellular respiration. So if you need to go back to chapter 3 to the learning objectives, the very last learning objective talked about cellular respiration. So this was that process that happens in cells where they can take organic molecules and break them down and form ATP. So, and have that readily available storage of energy in the cells. And there was 4 stages: glycolysis, intermediate stage, citric acid cycle, and then the electron transport chain. So glycolysis is one of the sources of energy for our skeletal muscle cells. So when that multiple chemical reactions happen, we can get ATP from that. So that was, again, chapter 3 if you need to go back and review. So in glycolysis, the reason it's called glycolysis is we're taking a carbohydrate, specifically glucose, and we're lysing it, so it means we're breaking it down, kind of rupturing it. And so it takes a bunch of enzymes to go in and break down the individual bonds in glucose. So it does it in like a little pathway. And so we don't have to know all the details of the pathway, but we do need to know that we start with glucose, breaks it, a bunch of enzymes break it down. We get pyruvate as the product, and then we'll get 2 ATP molecules every time glucose is broken down into, and it's actually broken down into 2 pyruvate molecules. We'll get 2 ATP molecules from that chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction is called glycolysis. And this happens pretty rapidly. So this can provide ATP or energy for longer periods of time. So more like minutes rather than seconds, which was what these could provide. All right, the other thing that you should know for glycolysis is where the glucose comes from. So if you just follow the arrows, you can tell where the glucose comes from. So we can get the glucose from the bloodstream, and of course that comes from what we eat. So if we eat something that contains a carbohydrate, any type of sugar, starch, that'll be broken down in our digestive system, and then it'll enter the bloodstream, and that's where we can get some glucose, is from the bloodstream. And then the other places, recall that we have cells that store glucose in them. So liver was one of the organs where that was done, but the other place was the skeletal muscles. And so glycogen is the storage form of glucose. So inside the skeletal muscle cell, we have the bunch of glucose molecules all bound together in the structure called glycogen. But we can break glycogen down and release little individual glucose molecules, and that can provide the glucose for glycolysis too. All right, so again, this one doesn't require oxygen, similar to these. You do get a lesser amounts of ATP compared to the last one we're going to talk about, but it's pretty rapid though. So pretty rapid production of these. All right, so that was our fourth source of energy. And then our fifth source of energy is called, there's a couple of names for it, but aerobic cellular respiration is a good name for it. It's down here. You can see that. Aerobic cellular respiration. Sometimes you'll see it called aerobic metabolism, but I think if we just stick with aerobic cellular respiration, that'll be good. So what you need to know about this source of energy is it involves the citric acid cycle and then the electron transport chain. So, and again, recall back to chapter 3, the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain were stages in cellular respiration. So we call this part of cellular respiration aerobic because it does require oxygen. So none of these others actually required oxygen, but this one does. So you can see the oxygen coming to the mitochondria. The oxygen will either come from the myoglobin, and that was one of our structures of a skeletal muscle fiber cell that we need to know what it is. And it's the myoglobin is that molecule that binds oxygen, keeps it inside the cell. So in case it needs to be used for aerobic cellular respiration. But also the oxygen can come from the bloodstream too, because that's the oxygen that comes from the air we breathe into our lungs. It gets into our bloodstream. All right. So when we talk about aerobic cellular respiration, it can be pyruvate from glycolysis that is the product that enters this citric acid cycle and then electron transport chain. Remember, we're not going into the details of these, but these are involves a bunch of chemical or enzymes catalyzing a bunch of chemical reactions to slowly break down pyruvate in this case, or fatty acids or amino acids is another organic molecule that the aerobic cellular respiration can break down. And then same way with this one, it's the process of generating ATP through the transfer of electrons. So, but again, we're not going to go into the details. But what you should know is that you get a lot of ATP from this aerobic cellular respiration. It does go a little bit slower than glycolysis, but you get 2 ATP here. This you'll get around 30, 35. Depends on what organic molecule you start with. But it gets a lot of ATP generated. So this can last you for hours. So that ATP that's generated here is a source. All right, so we will talk more about the different types of skeletal muscle fiber cells and like which one of these they use primarily for their source of energy. And we'll finish up with the rest of the chapter in the next video. Thank you.